The next question will be around more abstract around founders. We were emailing about this a while ago, and I'd just be curious and maybe to give some examples of people maybe who folks don't know when you try to identify ambition in a founder. So you make bets on people super early. We did a video on that, but what is it about teasing out their ambitions or motivations?
Sure. Well, there's a variety of things. Ambition is a key element. I mean, you have to have this adrenaline and power. Building a business, building a company is really difficult. There's a lot of sort of ebbs and flows, or you kind of go through the sine wave of experiences sometimes by hour, by day, per week, per month, per quarter. And so you need something that powers you through that. And so isolating who's likely to be successful in powering through those difficult moments, the eating glass moments, as Elon refers to them, is part of the art. That's not the only thing. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for success. There's another set of criteria and filters that one uses to try to identify, potentially great founders. It's a lot like, as we talk sometimes in these conversations about sports, it's a little bit like drafting an athlete right out of high school in some sports or right out of college and trying to project how they will perform. So there's some data you can look for. There's some tests that the leagues use, some standardized tests. There's character interviews that they use, which may surprise people. Many people may not know that there's both empirical tests that the NFL uses, but they actually the teams interview the candidates that they're considering drafting, particularly in the early rounds. And so gauging an entrepreneur early in his or her career is very similar to that exercise. You want to have, just like the Oakland A's, you want to have a different model if you can, so that you're not competing with everybody. If you're using the same model as everybody else, it's unlikely you're going to earn superlative returns. So you want to use data, you want to use insights, you want to have a divergent point of view, and hopefully it's right.
And then any example that comes to mind from your years of angel investing of someone who had that crazy ambitious gene that we don't really know about,
Yeah, there's several. I mean,
anyone come to mind?
Well, I had as I think you're an investor in DoorDash.
Yeah.
I had the benefit of having worked with Tony at Square. Okay. So I could see some things that might not have been obvious to others. And that's a good way to invest, in fact, is with people where you have asymmetric information about the person. The best way to have asymmetric information is having worked with them before. Anytime you're interviewing someone in a short dose, it's a lot harder task to gauge them accurately. If you worked with someone under pressure, so I sort of got my angel career kickstarted by investing in a lot of my former PayPal colleagues. So I had a pretty good perspective on which of my former PayPal colleagues were going to be really good. And so when they went to launch companies, I said, hey, I want to be involved in this. Will you be nice enough to take my money? And fortunately, those people did well, and the companies thrived, which allowed me to do more investing, both financially and by reputation. But it was partially my ability to assess my colleagues, of the people I was working with, of who did I really want to work with again. And so anytime you have that asymmetric information, you should take advantage of it. So it's not surprising. I've actually just recently done an analysis that suggested about 60 to 70% of the people I've invested in my first 18 months as a VC are people I've worked with before. And it wasn't by intent, it was just that I feel I have asymmetric information. And I think always when I invest, I ask the question, what asymmetric information do we have as a fund? What asymmetric information do I have as an individual about this specific team, about this specific market? Because that's how you earn superlative returns.
So there's obviously a lot of interest, financial interest, in people investing in early stage startups, and you have companies forming around them to help provide signal. You have everything from AngelList, Disruption Corporation, CB Insights, Mattermark, and there's this sort of mega drive to rank what is generally an opaque industry, right? A lot of LP relationships into funds are not known, they're private. A lot of returns of these funds are private. Now, you've been around a lot, probably been an LP in some funds, I would imagine. What is driving people to kind of rank investment firms or rank investors? And is there actually a way to even do it?
Well, it depends on who the audience is. So I think, for example, ranking for entrepreneurs would be different than ranking for LPs. I think it might be productive in some ways to rank for entrepreneurs so they can help filter their own decision making, or at least have data and transparency. LPs, it's a very different calculation. Ultimately, they care about the money you're producing, and it's not the same. So I think depending upon what you're trying to do for whom, like US News and World Reports famously started ranking 20, 30 years ago, colleges and universities. And although the college presidents hate it, it actually is productive for students. In fact, it was one of the ways I was able to convince my parents to allow me to go all the way from New Jersey to the West Coast to go to this crazy school called Stanford. Was it showed up as #1 on U.S. News and World Report rankings, so I didn't seem like I was insane. And especially with the tuition costs and all these kind of issues, it was actually quite helpful to me. And I'm really glad, fortuitous that both I was accepted and that my parents allowed me to go. So these things can be really helpful. But if you mismatch, data for data's sake isn't necessarily good. So you have to have a high fidelity signal, process the data in a way that's intelligible by the audience, just like any other product. And so just because someone creates data doesn't mean it's useful.
But in this kind of world, most of the data, I mean, one's not going to be able to get the data from these funds.
The financial return data is very difficult for a couple of reasons. One, it lags so long. It takes 3 to 10 years per fund to have true indications on how well a fund's performing. Right. And so that alone is just a constraint. Second thing is, it's not our luxury to give away the data, because in fact the portfolio companies underlying that data are run by entrepreneurs, and it's really their data on their valuations. And so if someone asked me for our data, I would have to actually go to all of our entrepreneurs and get consent. And maybe one day that becomes something normal that entrepreneurs are just willing to sign off for, transparency into the valuation, but I could see why they're sensitive to that. So it's very difficult for those two reasons combined to rank funds. So like a feedback 2 years in of how a fund's performing doesn't directionally correlate necessarily with 8 years later, which is how things are really measured in 10 years, which is the end of the runway. So I think that's just a fundamental challenge with ranking VCs, at least from an LP perspective. Ranking them from an entrepreneurial perspective, I can think of other ways to do that.
Like more surveying and sort of...
feedback. I mean, it happens in a soft sense anyway. So when we're offering, and I'm offering to lead a new round, entrepreneurs ask for references. And we give them, actually I give them generally a long list, and email address, and say, here's all the people you can contact any of them you want. We put some of them up on our website. We have testimonials on our website that are word for word, from the entrepreneur. So that's a very, useful, although arguably less scalable way.
People probably now just do the cold.
They do, actually. That's the world's much more transparent between like Twitter and LinkedIn. You can get in touch with almost anybody, and we encourage that. So I think it's like we list our companies on our website. If you're considering working with us, you should call anybody you like, anybody that's worked with me, anybody that's worked with David, anybody that works with Vinod, Semir, and get feedback about the strengths and weaknesses of our firm versus others.
Right. I guess as a caveat there, maybe in the future, at least in the early stage, AngelList will provide some interesting kind of data, right, for both LPs and entrepreneurs to assess, because that'll probably be more transparent.
It gives you data about the kinds of companies maybe that are interesting to a particular investor, the kinds of companies that the investor is invested in. I'm not sure it gives you a quality of like how useful the investor is to a particular entrepreneur. So it depends again, it comes back to who's the audience and what are you using the data for? What are you trying to gauge? Like economic performance, utility of the entrepreneur, brand, all of those things can be different. Sometimes there's some correlation, sometimes they're not correlated.